In the summer of 1966, China was plunged into a storm unlike anything it had ever seen. What began as a political campaign soon erupted into one of the most traumatic and turbulent decades in modern history. At its center was Mao Zedong, a revolutionary who had once been the face of unity, now the architect of upheaval. He called it the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, but for millions, it would become known only as the Red Terror. This was not a war fought on battlefields, nor a movement confined to parliament chambers. It was a war on memory, culture, and identity. A war waged by the state against its own people, in classrooms, in village squares, and behind closed doors. The very foundations of Chinese society were upended as citizens were told to abandon their traditions, question their families, and destroy the past. The revolution demanded loyalty, absolute, unquestioning, and often violent. It began with a declaration. Mao, fearing his grip on power was slipping following the disastrous Great Leap Forward, called upon the youth to rise. He framed it as a call to cleanse the nation of counter-revolutionary forces, of bourgeois tendencies, and of old customs, habits, culture, and thinking. The message was intoxicating. For millions of teenagers across China, it felt like a mission with divine purpose. The Red Guards were born, young, idealistic, and dangerously empowered. These Red Guards, dressed in green military uniforms and wielding Mao's little red book like scripture, began their purge with fervor. Intellectuals, teachers, artists, and anyone with ties to the old order were targeted. It was not uncommon for students to physically assault their teachers or for sons to denounce their fathers in public struggle sessions. The family, once the sacred cornerstone of Chinese life, was fractured. Trust dissolved, replaced with fear and suspicion.
Ancient relics were smashed. Temples, libraries, and centuries-old artifacts were reduced to rubble. Confucian texts, Buddhist scrolls, and classical Chinese paintings were burned in bonfires intended to light the way for the new ideology. What was once revered became criminal. Even possessing a foreign novel or wearing Western-style clothes could lead to humiliation, arrest, or worse. The campaign wasn't random. It was orchestrated, fueled by propaganda and sanctioned from the very top. Mao appeared on massive posters, hailed as the Great Helmsman, his image ubiquitous across cities and countryside alike. His words were memorized like prayers, his ideas treated as infallible truth. Dissent was not only discouraged, it was dangerous. Those who questioned the revolution often disappeared without a trace. For those who lived through it, the terror was all-consuming. In rural provinces, villagers were forced to attend nightly self-criticism sessions, confessing imagined sins in front of neighbors. In urban centers, mass parades of shame humiliated accused class enemies. Public executions were not uncommon. The line between guilt and innocence blurred, and many learned that silence was often the only path to survival. Mao's Cultural Revolution did not arise in isolation. It followed the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward, an earlier campaign intended to rapidly industrialize China and boost agricultural output. Instead, it resulted in mass famine, with tens of millions perishing from starvation between 1958 and 1962. That failure, though immense, was buried beneath layers of secrecy and blame shifting. The Cultural Revolution was in part a political maneuver by Mao to reassert his dominance over the Communist Party and rewrite the narrative of his leadership. Yet it spiraled out of control. By the late 1960s, even high-ranking officials within the party were falling victim to the chaos. Lin Biao, once Mao's closest ally and designated successor, died under mysterious circumstances in a supposed plane crash after allegedly plotting against Mao. Factions within the Red Guards began turning on one another, and cities fell into virtual anarchy. The very forces Mao had unleashed now threatened to consume the state itself. Behind the ideological fervor was a profound human cost. Families were shattered, generations of knowledge lost. A culture that had endured for thousands of years was ripped apart in less than a decade. In many homes, the damage was permanent. Children who had informed on their parents would grow up with guilt that could not be erased. Survivors carried invisible scars. Some never spoke of what they witnessed. Others were too afraid to.
The terror wasn't always bloody, but it was always pervasive. It lived in the whispered conversations, the missing neighbors, the empty desks in school classrooms. It lived in the constant rewriting of textbooks, the surveillance disguised as community meetings, the omnipresent fear that a single misstep could end a life. And yet, the revolution insisted it was progress. By the early 1970s, the world began to take notice. In 1972, Mao met with American President Richard Nixon, an act that stunned the West and signaled China's strategic re-entry onto the global stage. To outsiders, China appeared to be modernizing, opening up, evolving. But beneath the surface, the Cultural Revolution continued to grind through lives and histories. Many foreign observers never saw the labor camps, the ghost towns, or the mass graves. When Mao died in 1976, the nation paused. There was grief, confusion, and uncertainty. But within months, the party leadership, now under Deng Xiaoping, moved to dismantle the machinery of the revolution. The Gang of Four, Mao's radical inner circle, were arrested. The state slowly began to rehabilitate victims and rewrite the story. The Cultural Revolution was declared a mistake, officially a catastrophe, though discussions remained tightly controlled. Even now, decades later, it is a chapter rarely taught in depth inside China. Public memorials are scarce. Survivor testimonies, when allowed, are often whispered or written anonymously. Yet the legacy is visible in subtler ways, in the caution of public speech, the reverence for authority, the lingering fear of ideological extremes. The trauma, though unspoken, has shaped a society that walks a careful line between memory and silence. What remains remarkable is not only the scale of what happened, but the silence that followed. Tens of millions were affected, yet few outside China ever learned the full truth. For those who lived through it, the pain cannot be measured solely in numbers. It is in the lost relatives, the burned photographs, the erased stories. History is never just about the past. It is a mirror to the present. And the story of Mao's Red Terror reminds us how quickly ideology can overtake humanity, how a nation can be swept into fear by promises of purity, unity, and renewal. It reminds us that revolutions often devour their own, and that power, once unchecked, rarely spares the innocent. The Cultural Revolution was not merely a Chinese tragedy, it was a human one where the very forces that were meant to liberate ended up enslaving, one where truth became dangerous and silence became survival. As we look back, the lesson is clear. Never underestimate the power of memory, of questioning, of human dignity, and never forget the cost of blind devotion. What China lost in those years cannot be fully recovered, but by remembering, by speaking, and by listening, perhaps something can be reclaimed, not just for China, but for all of us who seek to understand the price of unchecked power.